the series off with LADWP Senior Assistant General Manager, Reiko Kier, 8 Minute Solar Energy President and CEO Tom Budenbaugh, and CPUC Commissioner Leanne Randolph. If you missed it, you can go to our LABC website and watch it at your leisure. Today, we are honored to be joined by Sammy Roth, an energy staff writer for the LA Times, who will MC our program. The program will feature Mary Nichols, Chair of the California Air Resources Board, and David Hochschild, Chair of the California Energy Commission. As Sammy reported today in the LA Times, nearly 600,000 clean energy workers nationally have lost their jobs, with over 15,000 of those being here in LA County alone. There is a call for government aid to help this sector rebound and stave off a climate crisis. In addition, it is well documented that the federal government is rolling back environmental regulations, and there are calls at the state level from different business sectors to relax or slow down enforcement of existing and new regulations. So we have a lot to talk about. But first, I'd like to take a moment to remember our good friend, David Friedman, a public servant, a pioneer in clean energy for over the last 50 years. As you know, he passed away this week at 94 years old. And many of us did have the pleasure to work with him. And as you learn when you work with David, there's lots to know and learn from him, and he will properly challenge you to do more. He was a giant in his commitment, knowledge, and ability to create what we think of now as mainstream, a wholehearted acceptance of renewable energy and this revolution. He will be deeply missed. But before we get going, I want to note that at the end of the presentations, we will have a few minutes for Q&A. If you'd like to submit a question, Sammy will be receiving them. Feel free to do so during the presentation. Submit your questions. You can use the feature at the bottom of your screen. As you know, the LABC has been working hard during this time with our local, state, and federal partners to advocate for policies and programs that will keep renewable energy projects moving forward. It is my pleasure to introduce Sammy Roth, who will MC today's program and lead off with his own analysis. Prior to the LA Times, Sammy reported for the Desert Sun in Palm Springs and USA Today, where he focused on renewable energy, climate change, electric vehicles, and public lands. At the LA Times, Sammy has brought back in-depth reporting on clean energy and climate change issues that have been widely hailed across the state and the nation. He recently launched the LA Times' newest newsletter, Boiling Point, where he'll be helping readers navigate the recent climate change news and how it impacts communities and places. Sammy grew up in LA and knows that everything will be back to normal when he can go to a Dodger game. Amen to that. Sammy, welcome.
Thanks, Mary. I really appreciate that introduction, and you're inviting me to be involved with this event. I think this is a super important conversation to be having right now, so I'm really glad that the LA Business Council has convened this. Are my slides up? I'm not sure I'm seeing them here. Oh, here we go. So, what I'm most interested in today really is asking some questions of Mary and of David, which I think will be the most interesting part of this discussion. But I'll just try briefly to share a couple of lessons that I've been learning from my reporting over the last few months. The first one is maybe a little bit of an obvious thing, but I'll say it anyway just because it's so important. The level of uncertainty right now about what's going to happen with both with clean energy markets and with anything else is just just astounding. Just as one example here, I did a story last month that you're seeing on the screen here of this day in April when oil prices sort of took this nosedive and went below zero and went pretty deep into negative territory, which was, obviously something that one had never happened before, and two is something that I don't think anyone really could have predicted until, right about those last few minutes before it happened. So I think it's just important to, keep in mind that, anytime someone seems to be predicting with any kind of confidence, what the COVID-19 pandemic is going to mean for solar, wind, or climate policy or anything else, past the really immediate term, just to take that with a grain of salt, because nothing like this has ever really happened before. Next slide, please. Second thing, Mary Leslie referred a few minutes ago to, polluters and other companies and folks trying to push back against California's clean energy goals and, enforcement of regulations at this point. So far from my perspective, I haven't seen anything that really suggests to me that California is going to be backing away from its clean energy or its climate goals in a significant way. It definitely feels like those things are pretty deeply ingrained at this point. Just one story here that I'll highlight. Thought it was interesting and pretty significant that Governor Newsom chose as the co-chair of his task force on economic recovery Tom Steyer, who you'll probably remember was a Democratic candidate for president who ran mostly on a climate change platform and has really been a champion of that issue. I talked with Steyer about this, and it really seems like the main thing that he's doing on that committee is to prioritize clean energy and climate type investments as part of California's response to the pandemic and the economic situation that we're seeing. So it'll be interesting to see how that plays out, again with the caveat that it's hard to know what's going to happen, but that seems to be the direction that the state is trying to take. Next slide, please. Kind of a corollary to that lesson is that again, thus far, it definitely seems like clean energy markets continue to function in California, have been, receiving plenty of press releases about, solar and wind and battery projects, commencing construction, about utilities signing contracts. Just had a piece today in the Boiling Point newsletter that Mary mentioned that you'll see here about Southern California Edison just announced this, really massive 770 megawatt, more than 3,000 megawatt hour procurement of lithium ion batteries, which all need to come online within the next year under this requirement from the Public Utilities Commission. So the fact that, projects like that are still moving forward definitely seems to me to speak to the fact that these markets haven't stopped and probably won't, at least in the immediate term. Next slide, please. And finally, I think the most important lesson that I'd want to try to share is that I think what I'm seeing is that COVID-19, it's had this interesting way of amplifying these pre-existing challenges and opportunities that we've had in the clean energy and climate space. Taking these problems and opportunities that existed before and just really magnifying them in an interesting way. So I mean, Mary mentioned that the story today about 600,000 job losses in clean energy. That's clearly quite a staggering number, but I think in this context, what's interesting about that, is that even before the pandemic, as fast as solar and wind and energy efficiency were growing, that you still weren't really seeing the levels of growth that were going to create the kinds of rapid emissions reductions needed at a global level to to keep warming to 1.5 or perhaps 2 degrees Celsius. So, we already had this challenge of, how do we make this stuff happen even faster? And I think now with the kind of, short-term, at least, retrenchment that we're seeing in the clean energy space, that just becomes, an even greater challenge. And the politics of that, similarly, we there were already a lot of voices politically before COVID, sort of always making the argument of, climate action, clean energy policies, this stuff is too expensive. There are other priorities that are more important. This isn't the right time, that kind of thing. And, I think regardless of the validity of those types of arguments, at least me, I'm definitely hearing them, more loudly, now than they've been before. And I think that, because of the economic situation that we're in, and I think that that's a reality and a challenge that advocates for clean energy will need to confront and deal with. Next slide, please. And then kind of the flip side to that is the opportunities, where it definitely seems like there's going to be, a great additional need at the federal and also state and local levels for, economic stimulus to help the economy recover from the recession or potentially even depression that we're in right now. And there are already lots of, policy proposals out there and frameworks getting crafted and discussed for, what are the different ways or what are the best ways that those stimulus funds could be used to support the growth of clean energy and to build a new economy and to not just rebuild the type of very fossil fuel dependent economy that we had before. Whether that seems likely to happen at the federal level, probably not, with the current administration, but I think a lot of these proposals are sort of, thinking about, what would happen next year if Joe Biden wins in November. And certainly at the state level in California, there are discussions, that I'm following and writing about happening in the legislature about, what are the sources of, I mean, even if it's not the general fund, which faces I think the last estimate was a $50 billion deficit, but, what are the types of bond proposals or the types of existing funds or things that have already been appropriated that we could maybe speed up or use to have, some kind of stimulus effect. So I think there's decent odds of action at the state level on this. And sort of just, final point at a broader conceptual level, there's been a lot of reporting and I think a growing understanding of this sort of nexus between coronavirus and climate action, and tried to write about this a bit in last week's Boiling Point newsletter, which is what you'll see on the screen here. Just stuff having to do with research showing that people living in areas with high levels of air pollution are more susceptible to COVID-19 and more likely to die from the infection. Reporting on land use change and deforestation, which are obviously huge causes of climate change, and how those also make it more likely for a virus like this to move from animals to humans and to spread in the way that we've seen with COVID. And so again, sort of to be seen whether this all translates into anything practical, but I think there's a growing conversation surrounding this. And again, these opportunities here are being amplified when you can see how the types of things that could be used to fight climate change would also be relevant to the sort of public health situation that we're in. And very last slide here, just if you want to be continue that conversation. I'm trying to have it every week in this, this newsletter, Boiling Point, and would, very much appreciate latimes.com/boilingpoint is where you can sign up if you want to continue to have that discussion. Anyway, on that note, I'm going to turn this over to Mary Nichols. She, I don't think, needs all that much of an introduction. You probably know all about her. She's the chair of the California Air Resources Board, which is probably the most powerful state level air regulatory agency in the country. She's had that job under multiple governors across multiple decades, has been involved with the creation of just about all of California's seminal climate and greenhouse gas legislation, and has done all sorts of other stuff. And so I'll turn this over to Mary.
Okay. Well, I'm hoping that this is going to turn into a conversation pretty quickly, but I'll start off with a few comments just to sort of hopefully continue along the line that you started us down. First thing I think I would like to say about the question that was the kicker for this webinar is that California's clean energy and climate programs are deeply embedded now, I believe, in the fabric of everything that we do in California, and they're not going to go away. So any thought that we would suddenly turn a corner and shift our views or go backwards, I think would be foolish. And I don't think anyone seriously thinks that we're in any danger of doing that. I do think that we will be making some shifts, though, in our ambition, but they're going to be in the direction of trying to do more and to take advantage of the moment which this terrible virus has brought us, in which when your economy is really at a standstill, because the crisis that we're in now is not one of a failure of the banks or a failure of a whole sector. It's that nobody's going to work and nobody's doing anything much at the moment because they're at home trying not to be sick. So except, of course, for the people who are on the front lines of trying to care for the sick. So it's a very different kind of economy that we're dealing with at the moment, but it does give us an opportunity, I believe, to take a look at where we can move faster than we thought would be practical in the past in the direction of more clean energy, and in particular towards turning over the vehicle fleet, which is the area that I have the most to do with. The connection between climate change and COVID-19 is really a very interesting one. It's true that some of the effects are the same, and the people who were affected are, as it seems is always the case, those who were the least able to protect themselves. But it's also true that both the causes and the solutions relate to our failure to plan, failure to accept the reality of terrible things that that exist out there in the world, and the need to work together, in particular on a global scale. I know our focus here is Los Angeles and California, but California exists to a very large extent on international trading, on our role as a logistics center, as well as a major exporter and consumer in the Pacific Rim. And I think it would be a terrible shame if we came out of this without a better understanding and a stronger commitment to building international understanding and agreements that will persist beyond this immediate crisis, because we won't be able to solve either of these two great existential issues of pandemics and the global climate change without a stronger fabric and structure for coping at an international level.
Great. Thanks, Mary. And I'll turn this over to David now. Just by way of, again, brief introduction, he is the chair of the California Energy Commission. He's served on the commission since 2013. He filled one of the environmental seats on the commission. Previously worked in the solar industry. He was one of the co-founders as well of the Vote Solar Initiative, which is a very prominent advocacy group that I actually turn to in my reporting all the time. Also previously a member of the San Francisco PUC. David.
Well, thank you, Sammy, for that generous eulogy and for your reporting, which has been absolutely path-breaking. I really have enjoyed all your investigative work. And you did mention my one other qualification. I'm also co-chair of the Mary Nichols fan club, which takes a lot of time. We are planning some civil disobedience in protest of her intention to retire at the end of the year. So that will not go on without a fight. But let me just say, the moment we're in obviously is a earth-shaking moment, and inside every crisis there's opportunity. I actually think this economic seed planting we're doing for the clean energy future now is more important than ever. And yesterday at our monthly commission meeting, we approved $46 million of clean energy grants for new and exciting investments, including lithium development in California and many other clean energy projects. And this really is the seed corn for the clean energy future that we're building. And it's important to remember what we're doing in California, is a template for other states and a template for the country. Fortunately, in the electricity space, most of the authority that really matters to drive the clean energy future still rests with the states. So I had a couple of pictures I wanted to share. Rachel, if you could put those up. So where we are today in 2020 in California, we're at 63% carbon-free electricity in retail sales in California. And I continue to be awestruck at the mythology that's been propagated that, when the first RPS was introduced at 20% RPS, people said that was impossible. The 33% RPS, they said that was impossible. 50%, that was impossible. And the 100% target, I just want to remind everybody, that is a quarter century away. That's 2045, and we're at 63% carbon free today. The single largest resource within renewables is solar, followed by wind. And next slide. On costs, also, again, a lot of mythology on costs. In California, in the market today, solar and wind are cheaper than gas, cheaper than combined cycle natural gas. And the rest of the eligible renewables, small hydro, geothermal, offshore wind pricing, distributed solar biomass, they're all cheaper than gas peakers. That's where we are today. And the point to leave you with is that we are not done with cost reduction on these technologies. I am absolutely convinced we will get to 1 cent a kilowatt hour solar and 1 cent a kilowatt hour wind. And a project was just announced this week in Abu Dhabi that's already 1.3 cents for solar for utility scale. I mean, So there's a lot of innovation, much of it driven by what's happening in the state that can help with that. But this is why I'm optimistic about the clean energy future and our ability to get there. And I think there's obviously huge benefits from getting to these targets earlier rather than later. And the last slide is, I think I have one more, just what's happened in policy. So to remind you, we adopted the 100% clean energy standard, went into effect about a year and a half ago in California. We were the second state to do that after Hawaii. And what's happened in the intervening 18 months is incredible. We have 30% of the population of the United States now living in states that have committed to do 100% clean energy standards. 10 states have done that through legislation, 4 have done it through executive order, and many more will follow. This is going to be driven both because it's economic and also because it's popular. And so I am very optimistic about future policy to this effect as well. And I think the point I'd leave you with is that, generally speaking, the electric grid, I think, has emerged as the sort of backbone of our climate strategy. And you're seeing this expanding reach of the grid, most notably into transportation. With Mary's leadership, we have 700,000 electric vehicles in the fleet in California. We're also transitioning rail lines like the Caltrain's line from San Francisco to Silicon Valley, which is diesel and electrifying. You're seeing 30 cities around the state that have now passed electrification preferences or natural gas bans in new construction. And the grid is reaching into areas that it never touched before. And the nice thing about that is that with all these devices, I took out my gas water heater, I put in an electric heat pump water heater 2 years ago. That gets cleaner, as does your electric car, every single year as the grid continues to clean up. And all of those devices help ultimately strengthen the reliability of the grid as we have intelligent charging protocols and so forth. So I'm happy to stop there and then we can get to discussion.
So we're starting to get some questions in from folks who are on the webinar, and I believe you can use the Q&A feature on your screen at the bottom of Zoom if you want to send those in. Just as we wait for a couple more to come in, one thing that I want to ask you, you both talked about, taking this moment where we're in this crisis and sort of using this opportunity to be more aggressive and to speed up and to amplify the climate action California is taking. I'm really curious for each of you if you could go into a little more depth, knowing that California already has some of the most aggressive policies and targets in these areas anywhere in the country. What are the places where we could really see a phase shift and use this moment to take things up to another level? If you could both get into that, I'd be interested.
Sure. Well, from the perspective of the Air Resources Board, we're focusing now on the vehicles that we hadn't really done much with in the past, and that has to do with the trucks and trains and planes and ships, and the focus is there on from a health perspective, of course, the harbor and the areas around rail yards and other kinds of goods movement centers. So one of the interesting facts about the fall off in travel as a result of the shelter in place that we're living with right now is that while there was a very immediate cutoff of passenger vehicles out there on the roads, the truck traffic rebounded almost without missing a beat. And if anything, there's more activity going on both on the interstates and in the communities with the constant array of delivery vehicles showing up at people's doors to bring them everything that they might otherwise have gotten off into their car and gone to buy. So the effects are strange and not yet completely understood, but it definitely underscores the need for a movement in the direction of zero emission, not just of passenger cars, but of trucks and all other forms of heavy equipment as well. They're in various stages of commercialization. In the case of almost all the categories of trucks. There actually are vehicles out there now that are available, and it's a matter of getting them into the hands of the fleet owners and the businesses. In the case of others, it's a little further back from being affordable and ready to be put into some form of a immediate commercialization, but we're very close. And so, our goal here now is that by 2030, we're going to see all sales of vehicles being zero emission vehicles, because we have to get to that point. A few years ago, that seemed wildly ambitious, and one of those things that California does and then kind of tries to figure out how to make it real. Now we see it as very real, potentially, because the inventions and the technologies have improved, of course, but mainly because the costs keep coming down so fast, and the desire of consumers of all kinds to invest in vehicles that depend on petroleum fuels is just evaporating.
So lots of potential for clean vehicles. David, what would you say?
Yeah, well, first of all, let me just build on that. I do think some degree of work from home is likely with us for the long term.
Right.
And it is remarkable what's happened in the reduction of fuel use. So jet fuel usage is down almost 70% in the state, gasoline down 50%, diesel down 30%. And I think we will end up with a new work week that may be much, have a significant component of work from home, even once we're through this virus. But I think Mary is absolutely right on the transportation side. That is one critical infrastructure need. I really am committed to doing everything we can at the Energy Commission is to focus on electric vehicle charging, especially. That has big benefits for the grid as well. And so that's going to be a big focus for us. As well as seeding some new industries. We just put our first big tranche of money into offshore wind research and development earlier this year. And then, as I mentioned yesterday, we did 10 million for lithium development. We'll do another 4 million at the commission meeting next month around this vision of Lithium Valley, which is a sort of Silicon Valley for Southern California around developing the lithium resource in the Salton Sea. And that meets many needs. It really, I see it as the sort of oil of the clean energy future. And it's in an area with very high unemployment, and helps, build our energy independence and, provide an ecosystem. I think that could give the state, because we have a huge electric vehicle market and a huge energy storage market, which are the end uses for lithium, and we're blessed to have, the raw material. And we could attract back industries that are not here, like cathode manufacturing, and so those kind of things. We're going to put a lot of time and effort into those.
So we're getting a lot of good audience questions, and I'll ask one more of my own before I move on to some of those. You both, made the point that it's important that this, to remember that this isn't all just about California. That our goal here is to, spur action in other places. I'm curious. You both, I know, talk to leaders in other states that are working on this stuff all the time. What are you hearing from leaders in other states who, either have 100% clean energy policies or, goals in this area? Are they also thinking about this moment, in terms of ratcheting up or at least staying the course, or do you have more of a fear of backsliding in other places that might not have the the same ironclad commitment over decades to this stuff that California has?
I think in the first days and weeks of this process, there was a lot of talk about what was going to happen that might lead everybody to just freeze and not be prepared to move forward with their commitments in this area. I think there's, if anything, from the people that I talk to in other states, much more of a commitment to getting it done. The feeling that if we don't actually make the substantive changes now that we're talking about, while we're looking at recovery mechanisms, while we're talking about stimulus packages, if we don't get those shaped so that they support the transition that we know has to take place, then shame on us, because it'll be a long time before we have an opportunity to do it again. So I'm seeing, if anything, a real galvanizing of activity in other places and among not only government officials, local as well as state, but also in the private sector. People just saying, come on, let's get real here. This is time to, we don't want to see any more stimulus talk that doesn't include the kind of jobs that we need for the future. If people aren't building, if they're not drilling wells, they're going to be putting in charging stations, and those are real jobs, and they're good jobs, and that's what we should be going for.
Yeah, and I'd add to that. I mean, I think to be relevant now, any idea has to meet two tests. What does it do to protect our health, and what does it do to create jobs? And I think all this clean energy work clear. This is about making the air cleaner. And for much of the infrastructure we're talking about, it's precisely the kind of thing we need to come out stronger on the other side of this recession. And so, and with the data now around fatalities from COVID, right? It's clear that clean air doesn't reduce your likelihood of catching COVID, but it does add your likelihood of dying from it. And that is crystal clear. Harvard had a great study on that last month. I think there's another thing going on here, which is that there's a lesson inside this COVID crisis that's really about climate, right? Which is there are these challenges that require bold action, collaborative action with other states and other countries with a prevention mindset. And we are suffering terribly in our country from not having to. Why is it that this COVID-19 virus did not start here, but it's worse here than anywhere, right? And it does come down to leadership. It does come down to a failure to adhere to good science. And, we have more fatalities than any other country in the world. And more, when you think about climate, the benefits of getting out ahead on it are significant. And so I think that lesson is sinking in. Just to the interest, I'm seeing in other states, it really does help economically, as we've been doing these bold clean energy and climate initiatives, our economy has significantly outperformed the rest of the country. I mean, before the COVID crisis, since 2000, GDP was up 46% since 2000 in California. The other 49 states, 35%. So, we're meeting all these big ambitious goals, and it's working for our economy. I think that is a very powerful message.
So I'm going to transition into some of the audience questions here. You both spoke just now to the importance of, having policies right now that are creating jobs and showing people that, that's part of what this is about. I'm going to combine two questions. We've got one question here about shovel-ready clean energy jobs and what are the areas that can be prioritized right now where you can really put people back to work quickly. And then also a question about, the importance of keeping disadvantaged communities in mind and, using this moment, not just to create growth, to try to spur growth writ large, but to spur growth that specifically benefits those communities.
I can take the shovel-ready one. Just one thing we did last week at the Energy Commission, we designated all solar and energy storage workers as essential services. And that's really important to keep that momentum going. We may very well face wildfires and blackouts later on this year. And so the ability for people to keep electricity on, which solar and storage can assist with, was an important threshold. And that's a big workforce. I think that was the right thing to do. We did hit 1 million solar roofs last year, and we made solar a mandatory feature of new construction. And so that industry, keeping that going, I think is one example.
Marian,
yeah, I would just add to that one of the things that I think is coming out of our current situation is a real commitment to improve the level of understanding that we have of what the workforce of the future is going to be. Because while, yes, we need to talk about immediate measures to get people back to work, we also need to be, as part of the transformation that we're talking about, really looking at what the jobs of the future are going to be, what the investments are that we need to be making now to be able to implement some of the kinds of programs that we're talking about, and what the skill sets are that people are really going to need to work in those emerging industries. I'm thinking a lot these days about, as David mentioned, fire, about rural California, about what we can do to improve our ability to capture and store carbon that's in the atmosphere right now, because there is so much of it out there that the world is going to need to be moving in that direction. And there's a number of different options there that we're going to be looking at. So understanding what is going to happen to somebody whose job evaporates because that particular industry is not going to be in the forefront anymore, and how we can direct them and their offspring into opportunity areas that are going to be emerging, I think is a responsibility that all of us who work in this area have to seize upon. So, you know, we always count the jobs that are lost, and we're not as good at, I think, at counting the jobs that either are gained or could be gained based on different types of investment scenarios. And we're really starting to look at how to do a better job of that.
You know, I have a question on that topic. One of you brought up, I forget which one at this point, but talking about building decarbonization and policies to electrify. David, you were talking about that. You've done that in your home.
Okay.
I had a story that I wrote, I think it was last week, about pushback that's being seen among the gas industry and gas workers to those types of city level policies. And there was sort of a dramatic example. There was this incident in the city of San Luis Obispo where city government was about to pass one of these ordinances, and the head of a local union of gas company employees basically via email threatened the city leadership and said, I'm going to bring in hundreds of protesters and bust up social distancing guidelines and potentially make the pandemic worse, and in an attempt to block that policy. And I think it's interesting, and Mary, in the context of what you were just saying about this just transition, because on the one hand that's kind of shocking that someone would make that threat, but on the other hand it kind of feels to me, at least like with the economic situation in COVID right now, that fear of what's going to happen to my job in the future, how is this transition going to affect me, that's probably heightened even more than usual, and maybe speaks even more greatly to that need that you're describing to have a real transition strategy.
Yeah, absolutely. We talk now more than we did a few years ago about transition as including the people who are in the process of the transition, and not just where your electricity is coming from. But we don't live in a society that puts out 5-year plans and says exactly what jobs people are going to be doing. That's not the American way. I think what we do is we set strong standards, and then we let the marketplace come up with the solutions. And what we're seeing is that while that's had its benefits in terms of our overall economic growth, it also leads to some real disparities in the quality of life and vast differences in people's ability to cope with threats. So this is an area where I think society as a whole and government have got to make some serious decisions about what kind of responsibility we're going to take for helping to make sure that the transition is one that's as positive as it can be for people. I think David has talked very eloquently in the past about some of the opportunities in this area, and we see those at ARB as well. That we're looking for ways to invest, not just to tell people what you can't do, but open up opportunities for what they can do.
So another listener question here that's sort of a related topic, although I'm having trouble coming up with a good transition for it. Question about the upcoming wildfire season and public safety power shutoffs and the I know this is a Public Utilities Commission issue in some ways, and neither of you is from the PUC, but the question asks about the self-generation incentive program and the sort of importance of trying to get incentives out quickly to help people put batteries in their homes and do things for resilience. I think the way I'd frame this is whether either of you have any thoughts on what more can be done here quickly in the clean energy space to help people prepare for fire season.
Microgrids.
But quickly.
Yeah, so we've funded 38 microgrids around the state, and everything from Native American tribes to fire departments, and we're continuing to do that. Also R&D in storage to bring the costs down. And there are some innovative things happening. For example, one project we funded is taking used EV car batteries that work fine. They may be only 70% of their nameplate rating, so they can't function for a vehicle, but they still have a long life, and actually having a second life as backup energy storage for a building, that kind of thing we're piloting, which I think is very creative to drive the cost down. I want to just go back to the previous question though, really quickly, just to say, we had this debate about jobs, with the coal industry. Okay, and we heard all the same argument. It is, what's happened is we went from 52% coal power in our electricity portfolio in this country to 19% today and falling. And the renewable energy job sector is now 5 times bigger than the coal industry. And so I think the same thing will prove to be the case here as we push towards a decarbonized building sector. And you're seeing just a great amount of innovation and job opportunity there.
So,
can I just say one other thing though? Because this is in the potential of moving backwards. In areas where they're fearing that there may be shut off of electricity service in order to de-energize the lines and prevent worse fires from happening, it's permissible for people to go out and get emergency backup generators that use diesel fuel. And I've been hearing from people in the Bay Area in particular who are deeply worried about what this could mean if there's a proliferation of these generators around in neighborhoods, especially those where you've got businesses co-located near residences. And I think we have to do something on a really fast turnaround basis to get more battery operated generators out there so that we don't have a really bad summer this year and on into the future.
So talking about air quality, Mary, I think this is a question for you. We've got a question here about enforcement of air quality regulations and what that looks like during this, quote unquote, new normal as we, live with this pandemic. The question cites here a story that my colleague Tony Barboza wrote about, field inspections at the Air Resources Board that aren't happening, and some loosening of, maybe not loosening, but reporting requirements. There's been some easing around that. So just definitely interested in your thoughts on how we get to a place where where we can quickly make sure that we really are enforcing these rules.
Sure. Well, the first thing I want to say is that the story about cutbacks or weakening of regulations was one that was, I think that he had a hard time finding examples of that. Let's put it this way. It is true that we had to pull inspectors out of the field for a couple of weeks while we kind of figured out how we were going to have people working from home most of the time, how we were going to make sure they were protected. And so there was a period of a few weeks where field inspections were put on hold, and we had people instead catching up on monitoring data and using their other enforcement tools. But that is about to change in the next couple of weeks. We will have people back out there looking for the smoking trucks and other violators of our regulations. So that was a pretty short-term temporary effect. I think longer term, we all have to look at how we're going to operate in a more efficient way that doesn't require a lot of people to be, crammed together in places where they're doing inspections, next door to each other. But I think we have that pretty well under control. The real question is, when a business comes in and says, we couldn't file the paperwork we were supposed to file because, we're a small business and the guy who does that or the woman who does that was in the hospital because they were sick. Are you going to just go ahead and, fine them as you would normally, or are you going to find a way to grant some kind of reasonable accommodation when people can't really control what put them in a violation situation. And we are very carefully looking at all those kinds of incidents as they come forward and trying to make sure that we're dealing with the situation in a humane way, as I think people would want.
Another question for you, Mary. This one references some kind of reporting today, which unfortunately I haven't seen, but a story having to do with revenue from cap and trade being lower, as a result of the downturn, and question asking about what impact is that going to have on all the initiatives that we use cap and trade funding for, and are we planning for additional revenue sources?
Sure. The cap and trade program, in its basic design, is intended to run out of money. And it's unfortunate and probably predictable that anytime you create a source of revenue, people immediately become dependent on it without necessarily realizing that as you crank down on the number of emissions that people had to buy allowances for, you are also going to first drive up the cost of the allowances, but then eventually run out of them because people don't need them anymore. Everybody's cleaned up, and so you don't have a cap and trade program. So our goal is actually to put this particular program out of business. That doesn't mean there aren't other ways that you could tax greenhouse gases, but the cap and trade program right now is operating very smoothly. The speculation is that at the next auction, there will be fewer allowances sold. We have a floor price for allowances, so we won't just cut the price in order to get rid of the allowances, but they won't all sell if people don't need them. And if people are cutting their operations back and they weren't emitting, then they may not be in need of as many allowances. And so we could see a revenue shortfall into that fund, that greenhouse gas reduction fund. And I think that's likely to happen. We try very hard at the Air Resources Board not to predict or plan around the price of allowances for precisely the reason that this, from our perspective, is an environmental program. It's not a revenue generating program. If we were to go back and design a program to raise money for the state, you would probably do what has been suggested before, which is to impose a tax, a carbon tax. And that way you could collect it and predict it more. And it would be in the hands of the finance people rather than of environmental regulators like me.
So this is a question that builds on that, I think, for both of you. What would it be helpful from either of your perspective to see the legislature do this year in any of these areas we've been talking about? I'm sure you have ideas.
Well, I suppose we do. But, I think right now I'd rather focus on having a conversation about how we're going to get to the longer term goals. I don't think other than wanting to see us focus our whatever we do at the federal level on making sure that we have the flexibility to use federal stimulus money in ways that support the goals that we're talking about. I don't see that the California itself is going to be able to raise the kind of money that we need to make up for the horrific losses that we have suffered. I believe that the administration, are working and will continue to be working very actively with our delegation in Washington and supporting Speaker Pelosi in her efforts to put the federal government behind the recovery, because that's really what we need to be doing now. We can't do this on our own.
David,
yeah, I think it's just an important distinction to know. I mean, the tools available to the state just pale in comparison to the federal government when we're talking about stimulus and the ability to print money in the way the federal government can do. We just don't have that. But I would just say, and I think we're seeing this. The governor and the legislature are absolutely committed to our clean energy goals. And I don't see it backing down. I just think, understanding this is our economic and our environmental future, and keeping that commitment is the most important thing.
Talking about the federal government, a question for both or either of you here. How worried are you at this point about the federal government, using the pandemic in the next few months to push more aggressively on environmental rollbacks, and how that might affect us in California?
They're pedaling just as fast as they can backwards right now. I mean, they've already put everything on the chopping block that they could find, possibly out of a fear that this president won't have a chance to do it in another term. And so they're going to get everything they can possibly do done before the end of the year. They're cutting corners. We sue them. In my program, we've filed more lawsuits in the last couple of years than had ever been filed in my history at ARB. And we're winning on whenever we actually get to court. But in the meantime, we are facing an unprecedented onslaught of hostility and attacks on every kind of air and water regulation, as well as reductions in all of the programs that we're trying to create incentives for a shift to cleaner energy as well. So I guess my answer to that is I don't know how they could do any more than they're already doing.
Yeah, the dissonance is so striking. I mean, you have the president tweeting things like "liberate Michigan" and "open up everything," and then the EPA saying, "Oh, because of the COVID-19 crisis, we can't enforce any of our pollution laws." I mean, so it absolutely is being misused.
One specific idea that I've heard from the state level, and again, maybe it's a little bit more PUC territory, but I'd be interested in what both of you think. Do you see there being an opportunity or potentially value in forward procurement of renewable energy, of trying to get more more renewables and more clean energy built on the electric grid, even ahead of the the targets that we have in state law right now?
Yeah, so there are many ideas in circulation now, as we look at economic recovery, but one of them is precisely that, to actually accelerate the 100% clean energy procurement from 2045 to 2030 for state agencies, and then to use those power purchase agreements to try and seed some of the industries that we want to advance, including more geothermal development that involves lithium development, more offshore wind, et cetera. All those are being batted around, but yeah, that's one I've heard from several sources now.
And we've got just a specific follow-up here, David, for you. Someone wanted to know the the 63% figure you cited earlier of carbon-free electricity generation. I think just hoping for a little more detail, and specifically whether that includes biomass or not.
Yeah, so the way that works is the current renewable portfolio standard is limited to small hydro, geothermal, biomass, solar thermal, and solar photovoltaic. So those are all, and wind. So those are all included in that. Biomass is a very small fraction of that. And then the remaining resources, which are not considered under the conventional renewable definition, are large hydro, which is about 17%, and nuclear, which is 10%. And that's from we built 5 nuclear plants, 4 of them have been shut down. The last one is Diablo Canyon, which is going to be shut down in about 5 years. And then we get power from that. We also get some imported nuclear power from Arizona.
One more question that I think I'll ask here, and then we'll probably start to wrap it up. There have been all sorts of scary stories that have been written about different types of crises that coronavirus might interact with. I mean, there's worry about what's going to happen with wildfire season, in terms of both ability to respond to fires and the power outages, and people staying at home and maybe not being able to have air conditioning or afford that. There's we've talked about the air pollution issue. There's been reporting on heat waves this summer, which, of course, is another one of these sort of scary climate COVID interactions where you're going to have, people stuck at home as the temperatures get really high. Looking ahead to the coming months and maybe couple of years, what are the things that worry each of you that could affect the clean energy transition? What are the, sort of I don't know if I want to call them black swan events out there, because some of this stuff seems pretty likely, but what's the stuff that you're worried about that could derail things, and how do we prepare for those?
Well, I can take first bite of that if you like, Mary. Yeah, the thing that worries me the most is what happens in Washington, D.C. We have seen such incredible self-inflicted wounds that have really, made the challenge much greater than it needs to be. I'm thinking of things like the solar tariff. Now, who really pays that cost? That's borne by us, and so these things, the seeking to cut clean energy research and development money from the federal government, the failure to enforce just very basic air pollution and water pollution laws. We are going to succeed long term. I feel in my bones very confident about that, and I feel very optimistic about California. But the pace with which we get there, the speed with which we get there, really, it goes a lot better when we're partnering with Congress and the White House, and so that's probably my biggest concern.
Yeah, I think I'd probably say it a little bit differently, but it's the same issue. I fear that if we take our foot off the pedal, that we will slow things down to the point where we will lose some of the momentum, lose some of the participants that are in this with us now from the business sector, and that people will fall back into a sense that it's just too hard, we can't get there, and raise the bar even farther. This is a struggle that we're engaged in, which is a multi-year struggle. It's not certainly going to happen overnight, but if we can't pry ourselves away from the grip of our current dependence on petroleum now, uh, we will lose a lot of lives. We'll lose a lot of people. We'll lose a lot of opportunity. And I'm 20 years younger than David Freeman, and hopefully have at least another 20 more years to work on this. But I don't have forever, and I want to make some progress right now. So I think it's a question of whether we can get people to stay focused and focus on their own well-being, and that means we're just going to have to find a way to change the regime right now in Washington, or we won't get there.
Mary, David, thank you very, very much to both of you for being involved with this, and I'll turn it back over to Mary Leslie to close out.
Thank you, Sammy.
So, thank you.
And Mary, that was a perfect bridge to the end of our discussion, because I commit to 20 more years. David, did you?
I won, yes.
You're going to get 20 more years, apparently.
I heard it. We have it on tape, Mary.
Not necessarily the same job, though.
Okay? So,
I could do this from where I am.
that's correct. You can sit right there, and we'd be all good. No, I think this has been terrific. And Sammy, it's a pleasure to have you. And I think we all really appreciate, there was absolutely no hesitation in having you MC today as a LA Times reporter, because I think everybody has been really relieved to see the Times make the investment in someone like you, and that someone like you came, and that you're so good at what you do. And this is a big part of what Mary and David are talking about, that these issues have to stay front and center. They have to be transparent. They have to be understood. They have to be understood from a business perspective. This is like big business now in California. This is not some little environmental thing over here, okay? Those days are over. I mean, LABC's been in it long enough. We know, we saw the change being made. So I think this is an exciting time. And I want to thank all of you for participating today and sharing your expertise and vision. And if any of you out there missed any portion of this, though I see many of you were on, you can always go to the website or to YouTube and pick this up. And I hope you'll be able to join us next week as I plug our third sustainability webinar, which will feature Assembly member Phil Ting, who's going to focus on promoting a clean vehicle rebate program. So right up what you were saying, David and Mary. Also, Carolyn Choi will be with us, Senior VP of Corporate Affairs at Edison International in Southern California, Edison. She's going to talk about the critical role that the utilities are playing. And our very own Paul Jennings, the founder and chair of PCS Energy, will share his success in installing solar storage and EVs, which is really the model now to scale, right? That we shouldn't be doing any of these things alone. We should be doing these things together. So I will now hand this over for the last 2 minutes to Adam Lane to talk a little bit about the legislation that we're going to be supporting, particularly federally, and see if any of the rest of you would like to join us. So thank you to the participants, and
Thank you.
Adam.
Thanks, Mary. Can you guys see me right now?
Yes.
Perfect. So, as the federal government's considering a stimulus 5.0, we've signed on to a letter from the LA Clean Tech Incubator, which requests $150 billion specifically to support clean energy initiatives that in hope will protect our goals, but will also spur job creation and create for a more resilient economy post-COVID. Specifically, the request was $25 billion for zero emissions vehicles manufacturing, $85 billion for infrastructure investment, $25 billion for public and active transit, $12.5 billion for workforce development, and another $2.5 billion for innovation ecosystem and supporting small businesses in the clean tech field. There hasn't been a lot of bipartisan support yet for a stimulus 5.0, but it seems as our economy continues to tank and we have higher joblessness numbers, there will be some movement on a package in the next couple of weeks. We also had a major win at the federal level when the Department of Treasury announced that it would modify the safe harbor guidelines for the solar investment tax credit. This will provide an extension for solar projects that have been delayed due to the current health emergency. So any projects that began in 2016 or 17, if they've experienced any delays in supply chain and employment disruptions, those projects could not be completed under their ITC timelines and therefore would lose eligibility for the tax credit. So now with the safe harbor guideline extension, they'll have an additional year to comply and will be able to receive their full tax credit. At the state, we've been glad to support Chairwoman Nichols' efforts at CARB to develop an advanced clean truck standard, which is modeled after the zero emissions vehicle program. This is the first in the world policy when established. So we're very excited to be behind that effort, and we congratulate Mary on all her outstanding leadership. And then lastly, at the local level, we're continuing our work with our partners at LADWP on the new version of the feed-in tariff solar rooftop program, known as the FIT Plus. The FIT Plus will take the existing program, but add energy storage adders, locational adders, and time of use incentives. So we're working to ensure the program continues to benefit commercial and property owners, disadvantaged communities, and that it remains competitive with other in-base and DER programs. We hold our monthly update calls with LADWP on this program. We held one just this week. So if you're interested in participating on future calls, please feel free to reach out to anyone on the team. That's all I have for updates, and we hope to see you all on the next sustainability webinar.
Thank you. All right, with that, have a good, safe day, safe weekend, and thank you all.
Thanks.
Thanks.